Evening, everyone. Desperation is one of the most powerful human emotions. Because the chemical activity that happens when we experience desperation activates something called the amygdala, which is the fear center in our brains. And that's what drives either flight or fight behavior. And there are thousands of stories of people in desperate positions being able to do amazing things and take action in order to survive when they're desperate. But what if you don't realize how desperate your situation really is? Well, when the Titanic set sail in 1912, it was hailed as the pinnacle of human achievement. Unsinkable, certainly luxurious, it was virtually invincible, and people boarded with full confidence, looking forward to enjoying the music, or fine dining, or laughter, or just the promise of a brighter future on the other side of the Atlantic. But even after the ship struck that infamous iceberg, many of the passengers didn't realize how desperate their situation was about to become. Some of the higher class refused to leave the dining room. Some of them continued to play or party out on the deck. Others even mocked those that were putting on life jackets. After all, it was the Titanic. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Well, fast forward a couple of hours, and those passengers realized just how desperately they needed saving. But by then it was too late. The decks began to tilt, and the freezing water started to rise. And that moment revealed something, that comfort can be a powerful illusion. Because we can feel safe or secure, even in control, while completely unaware that we are in real and urgent danger. And that is like our spiritual needs. Because the tragedy for many of us isn't just that we're spiritually desperate, it's that we don't realize it. We confuse stability with safety or routine with righteousness. But in reality, all of us are spiritually drowning, broken and helpless, unless Jesus intervenes. And in Mark chapter 7, we meet two people who are in desperate situations of their own. A Gentile woman with a demon-tormented daughter, and a deaf man who also couldn't speak. And neither of them had false comfort to hide behind. They had no illusions of being able to fix their own circumstances. And it's because they saw their own needs clearly that they were able to take action and throw themselves at the only one who could save them. So here's two questions that we'll carry with us tonight. Do you see yourself for who you really are? And do you see what Jesus came to do for you? Because spiritual desperation isn't something that we need to fear. It's actually a gift, because it opens the door to grace. And we'll see, as we go through the text, that Jesus meets desperate people not with rejection, but with healing, with compassion, and with restoration. So as we dive into the passage today, Mark takes us away with Jesus on a little trip, first to the city of Tyre on the Phoenician coast, and then down into the region of the Decapolis. And both of these places were Gentile territory, and they make for a pretty interesting settings for both of the encounters that Jesus has, because they were places that, by Jewish standards at least, were considered unclean or certainly unfavored by God. But it's here in these two places of supposed spiritual uncleanliness that we see remarkable faith and restorative healing. Now, it'd be easy to look at both of these stories individually as wonderful miracles, and they are. But this passage is so much more than that. These aren't just two random miracles that Mark has put next to each other. And when we study them together, these intimate encounters reveal a life-changing message. Because these verses challenge us to look into our own hearts and to think about how we see our own spiritual need. Look with me at chapter 7, verse 25 and 24. We are about to meet the Gentile woman who comes and falls at the feet of Jesus in desperate need. And verse 24 says, when Jesus arrived in Tyre, he didn't want anyone to know he was there, but word of his presence spread. With news of the Jewish teacher who was performing miracles in the name of God and rebuking religious leaders must have travelled pretty rapidly up the eastern Mediterranean coast. Because in verse 25 and 26, we see that as soon as the woman hears about Jesus' presence, she goes to fall at his feet and begs him to drive this demon out of her little daughter. And it might seem like a totally natural thing to do for a mother with a child in need, but this is a really bold move from the woman. Because we need to remember that this is a patriarchal society. Public interaction with a male rabbi would have been massively frowned upon. She's a Gentile, and she's approaching a Jewish teacher. And any good Jew in that time would have viewed the Gentiles as unclean, but certainly outside of the promises of God. Furthermore, she's Syrophoenician, Canaanite by ancestry. She's actually a descendant from a people who were historically seen as enemies of God. And in Matthew chapter 15, verse 23, which is Matthew's account of this same story, we see that the disciples even urge Jesus to send her away. They dismiss her as a nuisance, unworthy of Jesus' time. But this woman cannot be stopped. She pushes her way past centuries of religious division, ethnic hostility, and some grumpy disciples to fall at Jesus' feet and beg him to help her. And so what does Jesus say in response to this bold display of perseverance? Look with me at verse 27. Jesus says, "First, let the children eat all they want," he told her, "for it is not right to take the children's food and toss it to the dogs." Well, you might be thinking, did Josh just read the wrong thing? Because it doesn't seem like the normal, compassionate response that we're used to seeing from Jesus. In fact, you might even say it was pretty rude. But when Jesus says this, he's referring to the Jewish belief that the Messiah is just for the Jews. The Messiah that is prophesied about in the Old Testament is for the Jews only and not for the Gentiles. And when he says it's not right to take the food and throw it to the dogs, what he's saying is it's not right to take what is for the Jews and give it to the Gentiles. And he's doing this because he's highlighting the fact that this woman's status as a Gentile puts her on the outside of God's chosen people. And he's kind of provoking her, but he's also playing up to what the disciples who were watching on would have been thinking. Because Jesus is highlighting the religious and the social barrier that the Messiah is just for the Jews. So how will this woman respond to the apparent rejection? Well, let's look at verse 28. "Lord," she replied, "even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Well, you would think that after Jesus' seemingly harsh response that she would be angry or defiant. But the woman responds with remarkable humility. And it's a powerful moment of self-awareness because she's acknowledging her lowly position. She recognizes her unworthiness, not as a cause for despair, but as a posture of faith. She's not entitled. Instead, she appeals to Jesus' mercy, believing that even the smallest expression of his power, even just a crumb, is enough to save her little daughter. And this tells us that she recognizes Jesus not just as the Jewish Messiah, but her Messiah also. She recognizes not just her daughter's immediate need, but her own position before God. And in verse 29, Jesus says to her, "For this reply you may go, the demon has left your daughter." Jesus affirms her faith. The woman's daughter is healed. The perceived barrier that we mentioned is smashed to pieces. Because there are no barriers to God's kingdom for those of us who recognize Jesus as the Savior that we don't deserve, but that we desperately need. If you recognize that you were a sinner and that sin needs to be punished and that Jesus was the Son of God, and you trust that when he died on the cross, the price for your sin was paid, then you are saved. You have a place in God's kingdom, and you do for eternity. There's no barriers there. You don't have to be brought up in church and go to Sunday school every week. You don't have to have been christened as a baby. You don't have to have read the Bible cover to cover. But sometimes we make our own barriers, don't we? Now, I can't follow Jesus, so I'll have to change too much about the way I live. Or I'm too much of a sinner, Jesus can't help me. Or even I go to church, that's enough. I don't have to give everything over to Jesus. And the truth is, we can be too bothered about how things look on the outside without actually realizing the desperate need inside. We're going to have a quick look back at the start of chapter 7, verses 1 to 23, because Jesus has a back and forth with some of the Pharisees about their adherence to human ceremony over humble hearts that recognize their position before God. And this discourse with the Pharisee happens immediately before the passage that we're focusing on tonight. And that's not an accident from Mark. He wants us to notice the contrasts that are highlighted here. Jesus rebukes the Pharisees for their hypocrisy, exposing how their concern with outward rituals masks hearts that are actually far from God. And while the Pharisees appear religious but lack true humility and faith, the woman in our story demonstrates the kind of heart that God honors. One that knows that her salvation is out of her hands, but that Jesus can save her. Because appearing religious or following the rules is not what can save us from our desperate situation as sinners against God. Only faith in Jesus as your Savior can. And that's why the woman's faith is so striking and so challenging to us. Because it is rooted in such a clear understanding of who she is and who Jesus is. She does not come demanding, but believing that Jesus' grace overflows beyond the boundaries of any status enforced by society. Her desperation drives her to a place of spiritual clarity. She sees herself not as someone deserving, but as someone in desperate need. And most importantly, she sees Jesus as the one who can meet that need. Her heart attitude is directly opposite to those of the Pharisees who saw themselves as deserving of a place in God's kingdom because of their status and adherence to religious tradition. And so the challenge for us is, do we see ourselves for who we really are? Do we recognize that we are also outsiders, undeserving, and in desperate need of a Savior? Or are we like those passengers on the Titanic who didn't think they needed saving until it was too late. Well, here are two questions for us to think about around our tables tonight. We're going to have a few minutes to discuss, and then I'll come back up to take us through the second part of our passage. Okay. Well, let's end our discussions there and come back together so that we can move on to the next part of our passage tonight. Because now we're going to move on to verses 31 to 37. Jesus moves on into the region of the Decapolis, where some people bring before him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk. They beg Jesus to place his hand on him. Jesus takes the man aside. He puts his fingers into the man's ears. He spits and touches the man's tongue. He looks towards heaven and he sighs, "Be opened." And verse 35 tells us that the man is healed. Now, I understand, might sound a bit strange. The thought of someone putting their fingers in your ears might make you feel a bit uncomfortable. But let's see this for what this really is. Jesus intimately and empathetically meeting this man at his point of need and restoring him to wholeness. What an amazing miracle. But this is more than just a healing. Please look with me back to Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6. Which says, "The eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. The lame will leap like a deer, and the mute tongue will shout for joy." And this prophecy pointed forward to the coming of the Messiah, the one anointed by God to deliver his people from their sin. The one who would not only bring physical healing, but also spiritual renewal to God's people. And by opening the deaf man's ears and loosening his tongue, Jesus is directly fulfilling these words, revealing himself as the promised Saviour who will restore all that sin has broken. The promised Saviour who came to restore all people, whether they are Jew or Gentile. The promised Saviour who takes undeserving outsiders, like the woman, like me, like you, from desperation to restoration. Not just physically, but spiritually, where our real need is. And I know this because it's something that I have experienced, just like many of you have. The healing of this man invites us to reflect on the kind of relationship that Jesus desires to have with us. Because he doesn't just want to fix us from afar. He wants to come close, to touch the parts of us that are hurting, hidden, or broken, and bring restoration in a deeply personal way. Jesus gently but deliberately comes into our lives and meets us in our most vulnerable places. And it was at my lowest point, when I was totally desperate for something to change in my life, that Jesus met with me. You know, there were things in my life that just would not change, no matter how much I wanted them to. I was in a cycle of feeling ashamed of who I was, but then continually doing things my own way and rejecting God. Because I didn't see my desperate spiritual need. I thought it wasn't that bad. But then when I saw my need, my sin, was something that I could not fix on my own, Jesus restored me. Jesus made me whole. And Jesus' interaction with this man is a beautiful illustration of the gospel. Because we're not just recipients of his grace, we're known, we're seen, and we're intimately restored by the Messiah, the promised Saviour, Jesus. And this kind of personal and loving restoration is at the heart of what it means to be in relationship with Jesus. And so now as we close, we take a minute to look into our own hearts. What is it that you see? Maybe like the Syrophoenician woman, you see desperation, you see your limits, your unworthiness, your real position before God. Maybe you see areas of your life where you've tried to appear clean or put together, but in truth you're still clinging on to outward appearance, tradition, or just pride, like the Pharisees. Maybe you don't know what you see, but you just know that life feels broken and hard and sad and hopeless. Well, we've seen that Jesus doesn't turn away from the desperate or the broken. He welcomes the humble, the ones who see their needs clearly and who run to him in faith. The Gentile woman wasn't cast aside, she was restored. Her desperation became the doorway to her transformation, and it can be for all of us too, if only we see ourselves for who we really are. Because Jesus is not just a miracle worker, he is the Messiah. He is the promised Savior. He fulfills the prophecies of Isaiah. He opens deaf ears, loosens silent tongues, and restores what sin has twisted and broken. Jesus is the restorer not just of physical bodies, but of lives, of souls. And no matter your background or your baggage or how far you feel from God today, the Messiah came to restore you. We don't need to be impressive on the outside or fail to try and live a perfect life. We need to be honest. We need to see our desperate need, and we need to come to him humbly and believe, just like the woman did, that even the smallest crumb of his goodness and grace is enough to restore us.